Classical. Welcome back to another classical music podcast. My guest today is someone that I have known for most of my professional life. I think he will correct me if I say that he may have even known me long before my professional life began. But
Maestro for a while Vladimir, before, yeah.
Maestro Vladimir Lande is a conductor extraordinaire, an oboist by training. The principal conductor, music director and conductor of the Siberian State Symphony Orchestra, and the principal guest conductor of the St. Petersburg Symphony. I have had the privilege to play with him a number of times. So if we wax into reminiscence and fall into, trotting down memory lane, I hope that you will indulge us. Please welcome Maestro Vladimir Lande.
Thank you, Emil. It's a great pleasure to be here today.
It's definitely a first for us in all of our collaborations to do this whole, interviewee.
Yes, I would like to add that I'm also music director of Cosmic Symphony Orchestra in the United States, which is very close to my heart. It's great people, fantastic orchestra. So, and you have performed with them
privilege of performing
numbers of times. Yes, and so is your great, wonderful mom, Nina Bailina. So I'm very proud of this group.
There may be some news and updates about some projects regarding my mother and some other musicians. We can maybe mention that later.
Great, looking forward to hear it.
Actually, this whole sort of look back is a great jumping off point, just so that you can tell the people watching this, many of whom are students, prospective students, people thinking of getting into music, and of course, they're very worried parents.
Right.
So if you can recount a little bit of your path, how you went from double reed to baton, that would be instructive.
Sure. I've started as a pianist. My mom is a pianist, and I've started very early. So I was a pianist for a while, and then I fell in love with the sound of the oboe. I've started oboe fairly late, when I was a teenager already.
What is normal for an oboe start?
Well, I mean, it's preferably that oboists will start at the age of, 8 or 10. I've started a few years after that. But I went very fast. I improved very fast, and by the age of 19, I was already a soloist oboist for used to be Leningrad Philharmonic. Now it's the St. Petersburg Philharmonic.
My children have learned that in Russia, you can move without ever having to pack a suitcase. All you have to do
is from Leningrad to St. Petersburg. Yes, just because the city has been renamed. Yes, actually got the original name back because it was named by Peter the Great as a St. Petersburg, but not a tribute to Peter the Great himself. It's rather a tribute to Saint
Peter.
Yes, Saint Peter. So simultaneously at the same time, I have started to learn the conducting, and I had to.
Was that standard? Did you choose that, or was that?
No? I have chosen that. Well, it's a standard even in even before the conservatory to have classes in conducting, and I did. But then I've started to be more and more deeply interested in conducting, although there were so many fantastic music to be played on the oboe, and there were so many conductors, great conductors to work with at the time. So I was greatly appreciating the opportunities. And of course, with St. Petersburg Philharmonic, I had to travel abroad. There were many tours, abroad and throughout Soviet Union at the time. So I couldn't really dedicate as much time studying conducting as I really wanted. So I've conducted here and there. I've studied here and there. I've started to visit lessons of Professor Musin, who was really fantastic and wonderful, and really a great teacher, musical father to many best of the best conductors. But then seriously, I got involved into studying conducting in the United States with a late Gustav Meier, and also with
Peabody Conservatory.
Peabody Conservatory, a really fantastic friend of mine and mentor, and really great musician, Edward Polachek, who influenced me not only actually as a conductor, but of course as a musician. And it was a great pleasure to play oboe for him, for his groups. I have also performed as a principal oboist, first oboe in Baltimore Opera, and then slowly got into conducting in Baltimore Opera as well. So I was only very late, right before the opera had folded, unfortunately, and then there were few attempts to revive that. So, but now in Russia, I am enjoying greatly, well, in Russia and throughout the world, actually, now, I'm enjoying greatly to conduct symphonic orchestras as well as operas. It's a great, fantastic pleasure to be part of both worlds, because symphonic works is something that takes tons and tons of preparations, but it's basically like you have to work more as a stage director, basically knowing exactly how it's supposed to be during the concert.
With symphonic repertoire.
With a symphonic repertoire, yes. Yeah, with the opera repertoire is a little bit more spontaneous. You have to know exactly how the opera should go, but because it's a synthesis, it's a marriage of so many different types of arts. Of course, it's at any given moment, things are going much more, let's say, unpredictably, and so we can maybe compare it to a good jazz performance where everybody's improvising. Well, it's a bit less improvising in opera, hopefully, because sometimes it's even more. Yeah.
Sometimes the improvisation is unintentional.
Right. But it's a great pleasure to be, of course, part of the opera, because it's a drama, it's a singing, it's a stage, things happening on stage. It's an orchestra, and a lot of feelings, a lot of emotions. Of course.
And a lot of stresses and tensions and so forth as well. You're juggling the egos and the professionalism, not only of anywhere from 40 to 90 musicians. There's also all of the musicians on the stage who are musicians and actors.
Correct.
Correct. The vast army of people making the staging possible, the costumers, the scene, the set designers, etc. The juggling of all the different jobs in an opera or ballet performance has always astonished me. It's tough enough to lead an orchestra, but to do that while also leading everyone on stage, suggests being a master jockey who's riding not one but about 150 horses simultaneously.
Right. There are actually 116 musicians in my Siberian State Symphony Orchestra.
But that's for every opera production, or is that?
No, it's for the symphony orchestra. This is for the symphony orchestra. For opera productions, there are usually fewer people because you have to fit into the pit to the pit, and it's much tighter there than on stage with the symphony orchestra.
I want to maybe even take a step back just for a second, because we're talking about all these things, assuming that the people watching are either musicians or at least musically literate. But how often have you met with people who love music, but don't know what it is that a conductor does?
Well, I think most of musicians in any given orchestra would tell you that they still don't know why they need the conductor.
But they will say that, and then they will say, "But seriously." So
right.
Some conductors, I am sure, don't. Whatever they're supposed to do, they don't. But the job of a conductor.
Well, it's somebody saying that conductor is beating the beat, and the conductor has to keep musicians together. This is a job of a Kapellmeister, as they used to say in Germany. Or somebody who's just keeping the group together. But if we're talking about a real conductor, somebody who's artistic, somebody who has studied a particular music piece very deeply and really looking into creating a work of art. Because yes, musicians are in many ways translators for the composers who have written
As an actor would translate a
certain
playwright.
music. Correct, correct. But conductors are more like as stage directors, so they interpret the notes that are written. They interpret the silence that is written within the notes. Because actually, I think it was a great Horowitz who said in one of the interviews where journalist asked him, "How come that you are so successful? You basically performing the same music as everybody else." And he says, "Yes, I'm playing all the notes as everybody else playing, but in between the notes, it's different." And that's what gives a hint into what conductor is. And not only conductor, any great musician. And difference between a fantastic musician and truly great musician is very minimal, is very little actually. But it has to do with an ability to shape up the time, the emotions, to shape up an energy. And we have learned a great deal actually through this pandemic. I knew that before, but throughout this pandemic, we have learned that we are not really happy performers without the audience.
Oh yeah.
And only when we're sending a wave of emotions from the stage to the audience, and then receiving a backlash, receiving emotions back that going through my back, through my spine, actually.
You can feel
Back,
it. I
yes,
can
yes,
feel it with my
absolutely,
eyes closed when I'm
absolutely.
playing.
Back into the orchestra, when you channel it back into the orchestra on this counter wave, that's where you basically uh, feel that work of art is being happening right now. You can perform very, very well, but without that response back, there's really nothing that could be named a work of art. It's
Well, yeah.
only when audience is participating. And that's actually interesting because in certain parts of the world, in certain concert halls, you can create work of art, let's say, a bit more often, because in certain parts of the world, audience members of the audience, not just sitting back, relaxing, and basically coming with a feeling, well, surprise me or entertain me. They are willing participants, and only there, where audiences willing participants, they could be highly educated or not that highly educated, but if they're willing to understand what sounds are transmitting, what is actually happening, how they can participate in that, only then the work of art could be created.
I think it is. You're putting your finger very much on it. I think it is a fairly unique art form, music, in that it exists. It's transient. It exists for that ephemeral moment, hour, whatever. But it's not permanent, because the symphony may be permanent, the opera may be permanent, but this performance is just now. And you're absolutely right that the audience is part of that performance. If you
Equal part.
equal
Equal
part,
part.
if you, for example, if you watch a movie without the soundtrack, I remember recently seeing some of the rough cuts of Star Wars without the soundtrack. It's a totally different experience. If you hear an orchestra playing, even let's say in a dress rehearsal, nonstop, but there's no one in the hall barring one or two people, the conductor's assistant, somebody like that. It's a very different experience. The musicians don't intend to play any differently, but they don't feel this, energy flow back and forth. Absolutely. And
Right.
speaking as a recitalist, also, I think you'll agree as an oboist. If you play with just one other musician, with just two other musicians, if you're playing for a room that is, let's say, half full, a room that holds 200 people, but that has 100 people in it, the energy level and your performance are both different than if you have that same let's say 100 people in a room that seats 100 people.
Yes, and actually, it's interesting. This pandemic is almost like an experiment for me. Not a very
Not
good
a
one, not a
not
very
a
healthy
voluntary.
experiment.
Yeah.
But if we can get any information out of that experience, we should. Well, I was recently just coming on stage with a wonderful pianist, Denis Matsuyev, and he came on stage. He looked into the concert hall, and of course, in Russia, where I am now, you're only allowed to have 50% of the audience. So basically, people are sitting over one chair,
Yeah.
right?
Gaps
So kind of like
everywhere.
in a chess position, right? So Denis Matsuev comes up on stage. He knew about the 50% capacity, but then it makes such impression on him that he says, it's the first time that I'm performing for half the audience, and it does feel different than if you have a full audience. And you absolutely correctly said that we need a room to be filled up with people, and even if we have one or two empty chairs, you can feel it. You can feel it energetically.
Oh yeah, and when it's significant 50% absence, it's not the sheer number of people. There's a lot more people in a 50% stadium filled capacity than there are in a concert hall. But the concert hall energy level is far higher if it is filled up. I think
Right.
the notion of this notion of energy exchange is something that we can talk about, but until and unless you have performed and you have felt both the stress and the irreplaceable, unduplicatable pleasure of sharing this kind of tension with hundreds or thousands of people, until you have felt that, it's just words.
Well, basically, we have went through that again throughout this pandemic. We've put up some concerts where sound engineer would go from one musician to another, from one home to another, and record all sounds separately. And then I would kind of give them, as a conductor, I would give them the general understanding how music should be played, and then it all came together, but has far less value as a energy transmitter than if it would be a live performance. It's very similar to if somebody would ask you to tell about your feelings, about your life, to tell your story without anybody actually listening to this story. So we understand that the story will be heard.
Verbally, it'll be the same.
Right.
Delivery will be infinitely different.
Right. But if you don't see the eyes, you don't see the reaction of people who are hearing this story, then story becomes very different.
Yeah.
And you're not as interested into telling the rest of the story if you don't see how a people or person reacts to what you have said so far.
Absolutely. I think going back to what is the job of the conductor, the rehearsal is a very different thing than studying the score. So can you explain again you're speaking for the moment to a layperson, not to me. Can you explain to a layperson what it means to study the score, what you're doing when you are just staring at the sheet music, versus what it means to rehearse?
Well, when you're just getting the score, you really have to know as much as possible about the composer who has written the score, as much as possible about the time of composer's life when he has written the score. That means not only how he was living his life, but maybe his colleagues, his friends, what else was written at the same time, what else was happening on a political level, on a political
Background, context.
scale. Yes, background at the time. What was the economy? Where people were coming from and to, like if we're talking about something that was written, for example, in United States, we should learn, for example, that at a certain point there were more immigrants from Italy. At a certain point there were more Irish immigrants, and then Jewish, and then Russian, etc., etc. It all makes difference. All makes lots of difference. So you should really know. you should really know the background, and only then you can start really studying the score. And score is basically a map where you have all the players, you have all the lines, and of course you have winds first, and then percussion, and then you have all the strings. And if you experience conductor, even by looking at the score, just by looking at the picture of the score, you can already tell if it's a great music, if you personally will like it, or maybe not. So you can tell how much this composer, that composer, using certain group of instruments, how it's been shaped. And again, look, there are three major forms of, let's say, classical music. Only classical music has three major forms. This is sonata form, theme and variations, and rondo form, right? So you have to find out what is the form, what is the shape of
the outline
the,
of what you will hear throughout the
right,
piece.
right, and how you should process that for yourself, for musicians, for audience. And of course, you have to see how the, for example, development section is done, and then you should have your understanding of various composers and relationships between various composers. For example, development section in something that's written by Beethoven is done completely differently than development section is done by
Mozart.
any other composer, basically. Maybe Brahms' First Symphony would be close to Beethoven, but it's all done using a certain combination of rhythms. Or sometimes Beethoven just takes one longer note and one shorter note, and based only on that, he can write.
It becomes an identifiable motif. It becomes a motivic fingerprint.
Right,
that you, as the listener who knows nothing about music, will still go, "Oh, I heard that before."
Yeah. And then when you think that Beethoven has exhausted all possibilities into learning into this rhythmical figure from this point of view and from that point of view, he gives you surprise, and he makes a different articulation of the same rhythm.
And all of a sudden it
sounds completely different, and you all over again understand that you have learned nothing, and you have to start learning from the scratch again. And then, of course, there are many other composers. You have to get into the language of each composer, how certain composer does this or does that. And also you have then orchestration. You have to know if you have to guess a lot of times, or it would be an educated guess. For example, if composer puts a flute and a bassoon together, does this composer want to really hear flute and a bassoon as two separate sounds, or composer at a certain point is trying to create a joint sound, a combined sound, where
like one instrument
that has quality and the color of a flute plus the color of the bassoon. Mm-hmm. And at each given moment, you should try to understand if composer wants a combination of two different sounds, or three different sounds, or five different sounds, or he wants really an ensemble work that combine the sounds together.
A really chorale amongst the brass, as opposed to
a bunch of soloists together. Yes.
Yeah.
So, and then, for example, you can have an octave between second violins and first violins, or you can have two octaves between double bass and a cello or a viola. And then you should try to understand and find out, would be cello really a primary tone here, and double bass just giving a bit of a foundation, or the prime tone would be a double bass tone, and cello would be more like an overtone to that. So it would be one very broadly built sound.
But just again to give the
same thing with the first and second violins, yeah.
To give the lay person an idea of how the conductor shapes this. The conductor sets tempi. The conductor sets balance. The conductor, not just in terms of having the idea in the conductor's mind, the conductor translates that idea to, remember, 116 individual players. some of
Right.
whom may have the same idea as one another, and some of whom not.
Most of the time they all have different various ideas, and you have to be powerful enough in your will, in your mind, not only during the rehearsal to convince them to follow you, but during the concert where you have to be spontaneous, more spontaneous than during the rehearsal, really to follow you. Although I must say that rehearsal is also time to listen to each musician as well,
Who was
because
it? Who was it that said that you don't come to a rehearsal to learn your part? You come to a rehearsal to learn everybody else's.
correct. I think there were many great musicians who have said that. I wish it would be repeated more often to everybody. But it's important that not only conductor kind of gives an idea how certain piece should be played, gives the concept. Really, concept should be built together because it will sound different from one orchestra to another.
And from
Because
one conductor, with you
of course,
conducting Philadelphia will be different than you conducting, Siberian State, but also a different conductor conducting Philadelphia will sound different than you.
Correct. Because they're individual players, they have individual strengths and weaknesses, ideas, life experiences. They feel today differently than they have felt yesterday, sometimes very differently. Then the acoustic comes into play, because an acoustic really is something that could be not only set for a particular concert hall, but let's say in a summer, over the summer, acoustic is different than over the winter.
The
Because
instruments react differently too.
Instruments react, but people are wearing different clothes. There was a very famous situation with a concert hall in Paris, where in 1908, I believe it happened, where a concert hall that used to sound very good, all of a sudden sounded very echoey. And what they have tried to find out what had happened, until they have discovered that fashion of women clothes has changed, and women were not wearing as many layers as they were before, and that affected acoustic in a negative way.
You have
So
you have less sound absorbing material, furs
exactly,
and heavy velvet and so forth. Yeah.
Exactly. And so when people wearing less clothes have a tendency to wear less clothes over the summer, the acoustic in concert hall is very different than during the winter. They have layers after layers.
So the audience should know that they are participating in more than a sort of metaphysical way. They are also participating in a direct, acoustics, physics sort of way. Yes.
Absolutely. I was, when I was coming home tonight, I was in a cab, and a cab driver had asked me a very interesting question. He said, "Do you really have to be very highly educated to come to symphony orchestra or opera concerts?" And I have to tell that we should not forget that from the beginning of times, from the beginning of development of human beings, sound has been transmitting information in two different parallel ways. One way has become a verbal language, and another way has become a music. So there were two equal, parallel ways to deliver the information. And of course, we can verbally deliver a very emotional information. But words do help. Now, let's do not forget that in opera, we have a combination of the musical sound plus the words. So there's double of information. That's why opera actually should be sometimes a door into classical music, in many
rather than symphonic repertoire.
Rather than just symphonic repertoire. Although I must say that symphonic repertoire and classical music as a whole is much broader subject than people have a tendency to think. For example, the music for movies, something that really did help tonal music to survive. We're talking about music where you have melody, harmony, and rhythm, right? Rather than atonal, 12-tonal, 12-step music. Something that Schoenberg has been developing, and many of his students. So when we're talking about this kind of music, it had survived in the movies, really.
And in fact,
Because
we should point out that a lot of the composers for the golden age of Hollywood in the 30s, 40s, 50s, a lot of the composers were refugees from Europe who were, tremendously accomplished, not just classically trained, tremendously accomplished classical performers.
exactly.
Korngold, I'm thinking of, who wrote a phenomenal violin concerto. I don't remember.
Yes.
Was that before he arrived? No, it had to be after he arrived in Hollywood.
Yes, after.
But before he wrote that concerto, he shaped the sound of Hollywood for a good 20 to 30 years, and much more recently. When I was watching a documentary specifically about Star Wars, actually, when Lucas made the decision to have John Williams write the music for his space opera, right now it seems like, of course, the music of John Williams is Star Wars. Star Wars is the music of John Williams. But back then, when Lucas was making the first one, it was actually a daring thing to use symphonic sound, not sound effects, not some sort of a backdrop, not more popular music, but a full symphony orchestra manipulated by a composer, an actual composer, rather than somebody who was just going for effects.
Although I hear all the time when you have, let's say, some kind of event coordinators, of if you have somebody who is trying to put together some anniversary of state on stage, or a country, or something happening, right, that they using symphony orchestra as a level of professionalism to establish the general level of professionalism, to make sure that the whole event is at a certain level,
is suitably epic.
Yes. So yes, it's a daring thing to put a symphonic soundtrack to the movies on one hand. On the other hand, it does give you a certain level of professionalism that is really helping the whole result and whole cause.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going for creating the new, I use the word epic, but I'm not sure that there's a better word. If you're going for creating something like that, can you imagine Lord of the Rings set to a pop soundtrack? Of course not. Can you imagine, the Star Wars movies set to a different soundtrack? Of course not. I think the art form, the musical art form, has so many different branches that it's not possible really to summarize that. But the life within that art form, the training within that art form, we can give more insights into that, again, especially for parents, I'm thinking. I wanted to jump on what you said earlier about different orchestras and different sounds, and talk to parents about what it's like to be a musician, let's say, in Russia, as opposed to in Asia, as opposed to, let's say, in Europe, as opposed to, let's say, in the United States. Orchestral musicians, let's just begin there. How would you characterize the differences, either in the orchestral musicians, prospects professionally, and or training in these four different regions?
Well, first of all, in Russia, I think there's very much inherited from Soviet Union feeling that classical music is greatly appreciated by everybody, and it's something that should be a really part of life. It's really that kind of filter that filters out negativity, or as I usually say, that if we have a couple, husband and wife, who is after the concert still fighting, or fighting after the concert, that means that we didn't play concert very well. So in Russia, we enjoying greatly when four generations of people coming to the concert. It could be grandparents, it could be grandchildren, and everybody in between. We have in many regions in Russia, we have lots of young kids, and for evening concerts, for general evening concerts, we usually have a rule that you can come to those concerts if you are 6 years old or older. but all the time I'm having mothers and fathers or grandfathers coming to me and saying, Maestro, please let my 4 years old or 3 years old to come. I promise he or she will behave very well and will not interrupt the performance. And of course my heart melts at this point, and of course I'm allowing that thing even against the rule. And also this kind of participation that I was talking about before, that audience is willingly participants in the performance. So they're not just waiting for an entertainment. Actually, there's a good saying. We do have a Ministry of Culture here, and whenever something,
that's a difference, by the way.
Right. And whenever some project comes up that is not really a cultural project but more entertainment project, we have people saying that this is Ministry of Culture, not Ministry of Entertainment. It doesn't mean that cultural thing could not be entertaining. It should be entertaining, but on many different levels, really. So similar thing I'm enjoying in Latin America. I must say that audience in Latin America, of course, starting from Mexico and always south to Uruguay and Argentina and Chile and Peru, of course, and Brazil, audience is very similar to Russians. There are many great older generations and younger generations, many people who might be very well educated or not as well educated, who really wanted music to be part of their lives, and they're responding in the same way. They're participating in a performance. I'm generalizing, of course, but when you're dealing with an audience that is 2,000 plus people,
you have to, yes.
You have to generalize. And of course, when you know that, for example, some performances in Latin America are also broadcast to like 30 million people, and sometimes channels there, classical music channels, have very broad audience, you feel great. Not only that you have audience there in the concert halls, but you also know that it's been listened and watched throughout several countries, many countries.
How would you say this reflects on both the prospects for and the demands made of the musicians in those countries?
Well, I must say that we can of course mention the Venezuela
Yes,
El Sistema, yes, where musical education has been so much part of economics, so much part of building the socium, that it's been known as a very great experiment. The experiment's been studied everywhere, basically, and in the United States also. Not that many people know that really El Sistema really borrowed everything from system in early United States, where great Leonard Bernstein have been giving those fantastic, wonderful lectures.
Young people's concerts.
Yes, young people's concerts. And I must say that I'm watching that every once in a while, and always finding something new for myself.
I'm always impressed by the language that he uses for an audience of kids, to whom
Yes.
he seems to be speaking at the level that nowadays some people find appropriate for college students.
Well, I think the greatness of Leonard Bernstein was that he was so knowledgeable and so well packaging the information that it was educational and interesting for kids, for young adults, for older generations, for professional musicians, as well as for somebody who knows nothing about music.
But
he never allowed anybody to feel stupid or fool or not being able to understand. Yes, everybody were understanding on their own levels, but they were coming after those lectures. They were coming much better educated, much better prepared for not only music, but for participating in other forms of arts.
Cultural life, yeah.
Cultural life, yes.
But going back to Sistema, then, how would you say what would you say the economic impact was? How would you say that worked?
Well, that was created because there was a slogan of a person who had given first, I think it was like $30 million, a man last name Hebreo, which is actually means Jew in Spanish. The slogan was, if a kid takes a musical instrument into his hands, he will never pick up a gun. And because the crime situation was at the point very, very bad, so they have decided to create this system to make sure that the kids are exposed to arts rather than to the gang culture, violence. Yes. And as a result, I believe there are like 240 orchestras throughout the very tiny country with a fairly limited population. Of course, Venezuela is going through very tough times now, so we cannot fully say that, orchestra had solved all the problems. Of course it didn't. Of course it didn't. But how many lives of kids were changed for the better, for the good? And I see those musicians not only working in Venezuela, but throughout the whole world.
We can just mention El Sistema's most famous graduate.
Yes,
Gustavo Dudamel.
Gustavo Dudamel, but not only Gustavo. There are many, many great musicians, and of course, it's fantastic to have Gustavo as a leader to all of them. And Gustavo, in many ways, sets up the example of a truly serious musician who did not lose the joy of life just because he had studied classical music. It's a bit of a cliche, to see somebody who had studied so much throughout his young years, and possibly becoming a very dull person.
An old man at 20.
Yes, older man at 20. But you see Gustavo, who is full of life, who is really vivacious and expressive, and really the best normal person, so to speak. So and that's what I see in other musicians coming from Venezuela, from El Sistema, because I work with them all the time in different parts of the world in various orchestras, and it's always a joy to have somebody from El Sistema, because we always know that they greatly educated, and also they are so emotionally prepared for the job. Invested. Exactly. That's a perfect word for that.
I've often said to people that, it's no longer surprising to me how many musicians turn out to be allergic to music.
I don't think they're allergic to music. I find all the time that musicians have learned and have studied how to play the notes well, and hopefully at the right time, the right notes. But music is so much more than that. Actually, it's not about that at all. It's really a medium for information, and sometimes not even just emotional information, as we both know.
No, just aesthetic information.
Yes. So, like, for example, Don Quixote, Richard Strauss, where you have donkeys, sounding like donkeys. Basically, it's only played by strings and winds. But the sound is so close. It's actually donkey. Or you can have a great deal of various happenings, various very, very solidly described happenings that could be done by Haydn in his symphonies. And you understand that this is, for example, a peasant folk dance, and you understand what is happening, and you understand there's a love line there, you understand what actually happened. Did the boy actually got the girl dance with him or not? It's a lot of those things.
My wife is endlessly amused after I pointed out to her that often Beethoven represents musically his stomach problems from eating too much sausage and drinking too much beer. That there are things that are supposed to indicate the rumblings of a stomach and then a burp or a hiccup or something like that.
Yeah, well, sometimes it's that, sometimes it's chirp of the birds, sometimes
yes, but it could be profound or profane.
Yeah, it's a spring, it's a run, where you hear the water running throughout, slow movement of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, for example, right? And then you can have a thunderstorm and rain, and in fact, there are so many musical descriptions of the weather in music, right? So from Rossini to Shostakovich, and furthermore,
and beyond, yeah,
and beyond. Yeah.
To sort of give the comparison with what you've been describing with Russia, with Latin America, how would you compare that experience of audiences growing up, immersed in a culture, immersed in culture, not just in a culture? Compare that to the United States. Compare that to Europe. Compare that to Asia.
Well, I think Europe varies from country to country. And of course, musicians and conductors also becoming more of the media people. And there are a lot of members of the audience who are coming to hear, to see a certain musician who they have seen on TV or who have been known for certain things, wearing a weird clothes sometimes, maybe behaving in a certain way on stage. Although in classical music you have certain unspoken rules, you can't really misbehave that much, but still
you can. You just won't. You might not be hired again, or
right.
You might typecast yourself.
Right, and there are musicians who do talk to the audience. Actually, there are some conductors, some musicians who do give lectures, either before the concert or separate lectures, like pre-concert lectures or different introductions, or throughout TV, maybe streaming, as we're doing now, I guess. And it helps in a certain way, because it brings some audience that otherwise would not just come and hear how is that particular symphony sounding today, right?
So the audience is coming to see those celebrities, those
more famous people. Yes, yes, exactly. So it helps. I don't want to say this at all about that, but whatever helps to bring people into the audience, into the concert hall, really does work. And then it's throughout, as I said, throughout the Europe varies, because in Italy, musician is somebody who is a maestro, who had studied crafts, who had risen to certain level, who has risen to a certain level, who is appreciated by the audience, because in Italy, classical music is still part of day-to-day life. In many ways, in Spain as well, in Germany for sure. You have every tiny town in Germany does have an orchestra, yes. And some of those orchestras have started in 1700s, and they still work now. So for Germans, for somebody in the Netherlands, classical music is tremendously important, and it gives them probably a highlight of their week to come to the concert. And of course, there is a pre-concert dinner or after the concert dinner, and doesn't mean that they do not go to the pub. They very well might, but still a part of their life is a classical music. To a certain extent, in Great Britain, it's the same. I must say that Asia has come a long way from a part of the world where classical music was something that was brought in from other parts of the world. It came to the point where there's so many fantastic, wonderful Asian musicians who are truly setting up the examples and setting up the, in many ways, in a good way, a fashion in a classical musical
They're
fashion.
not following a trend; they're setting it.
Exactly. That Japan, of course, is a great place for classical music, especially Russian, I must say, especially Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff. Of course, Korea, but of course China, where there's so many concert halls, very well built concert halls with a wonderful acoustic, with a rather large orchestras and very large and wealthy opera companies. And so China enjoys this very thick cultural life now, and I'm very happy that classical music is more equally distributed now between all the countries throughout the world. United States has been for a long time a highlight of a classical music. Or United States has been this great lab where the best of the best. So United States has been an example to the rest of the world, especially after the great waves of immigrations from European countries has come to U.S. and New York especially. And of course, there are fantastic orchestras throughout United States. It has been hard to see that if 30 years ago or 25 years ago, 20 years ago, turning on the radio, you have heard so many different classical music stations and so many orchestras, and you can immediately tell, oh, this is the sound of Philadelphia Symphony, or this is the sound of Boston, or Cleveland, or New York, or Pittsburgh. Nowadays is difficult to tell them apart. I think it has something to do with an audition process, and this is the subject that we should talk about.
Yes.
The audition process has become a very different one. It has to do with lots of union rules, of course, but it also has to do with demands of the of some conductors, of some managers of the orchestra, some directors who are demanding very solid performance from each musician, but very even one. So it had become more difficult to have an orchestra a truly unique individuals, because this unique individuality
will
could
not
really
win you the audition.
Impact in a unwanted way the performance of the whole orchestra.
Can you actually? This is a very important point. Can you get a little more deeply into the whole what the change in the audition process has been over the last, let's just say, 20 years in the United States?
30 to 20 years. Again, I think when you have so many participants in the audition, when you basically have to select one out of thousands sometimes, and definitely hundreds, within a very short period of time, as opposing to, in many ways, prior to that, conductors were inviting a lot of times, inviting certain musicians that have known from other orchestras, have known by hearing them in a different various groups or solo. They were just inviting them directly to play in the orchestra. And so
without audition,
basically without an audition, or with a very limited, what we call a third round of auditions or trial in the orchestra. This way you could hear a fantastic Cleveland Symphony sounding of, let's say, an oboe, or fantastic Boston Symphony sounding of a clarinet, or for same reason, in Philadelphia, string sound, or a brass sound in Chicago.
But shaped shaped by the conductors in all of these orchestras, the legendary conductors,
The legendary conductors, correct.
who would put together a team that reflected, their what they heard in their inner ear.
Right.
So
And
the Philadelphia sound is Ormandy.
right. And at that time, if we look into the time span of how long certain conductors, certain music directors have worked with one particular orchestra, it was much longer time, a much longer period of time, where it was actually a time for a conductor to build his, or nowadays her, a vision how this particular orchestra should sound. And it takes
probably the mode of travel, had an impact earlier in the 20th century, because when it would take you a couple of days to get from place to place, just yes, the flight itself would take longer, but then the shaking off jet lag, etc., would take a few days more. You simply didn't have a conductor conducting, in the morning in Paris, then hopping a Concorde or something and conducting in the evening in Tokyo. I'm exaggerating, obviously.
No, you're actually not very much exaggerating. There are some that doing exactly what you just said.
Yeah. So when you have a conductor who, shows up from place to place, the conductor's own imprint on the orchestra, it's still there, but
Right.
the shaping of that orchestra between those visits is not.
Correct. And there are some great visiting conductors or guest conductors who can, in a very short period of time, create the sound of their own orchestra using, let's say, somebody else's orchestra.
You have had to do this. You've had to come in and conduct an orchestra that you had no hand in putting together in any way.
Correct.
What do you do? How do you shape it to be a reflection of you?
Well, of course, you use first rehearsal in many ways to learn the abilities and strengths and weaknesses of orchestra members. And then you have to react very quickly. You don't even have time until the next rehearsal. You have to do it right on the spot, how to use those strengths and how to fix those weaknesses, to build the sound that you have in your head, in your mind, in your ears, in your pre-hearing. And it's very important. It's known that one of the greatest ever lived conductor, Carlos Kleiber, only conducted 30 concerts between 1983 and 2003, the time of his death. Only 30 concerts.
He conducted 30 concerts in 30 years?
Yes. So basically, or 30 known concerts at least, or those that were, with the biggest and greatest orchestras.
Mm-hmm.
He had come to some of the orchestras even for a very high fee. He would start rehearsing with them, and then finding out that the orchestra doesn't fit into his pre-hearing, into his concept of how this and that should be, and he would just leave. And it wouldn't matter if he was losing $3 million or he was losing $30,000. He would not compromise. He would only conduct orchestras, those orchestras that match his imagination, his pre-hearing, his understanding how it should be sounding. It's an extreme, of course, extreme sample, but we all trying to work very vigorously and very quickly. And nowadays, again, the amount of rehearsals is much fewer than used to be. By the way,
what is the schedule? This is also a good point about comparing different regions. What is the schedule like for a Russian orchestra in terms of rehearsals, pre-concert versus American?
Well, in Russia, let's say in an orchestra, usually the free day is a Monday, because we do work on weekends. We must, right? And then you do rehearsal on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and on Friday sometimes already rehearsal and a concert, and then it could be Friday another rehearsal, and Saturday rehearsal and a concert, and it could be repeated on Sunday as well. But at least you have 3-4 days of very solid rehearsals. And in Russia, you have rehearsals basically that last 4 hours compared to a lot of American orchestras that would only rehearse for 2.5 hours. So you basically do have
more time to work with.
Right, but then of course there are sectionals. There are rehearsals for certain sections, groups of the orchestra. There are possibilities of extending rehearsals. There are possibilities of asking for more in advance if you think that certain piece is lesser known or more difficult.
Yeah, it should be pointed out that of course the musicians are not playing one work and then never playing it again. The 3 rehearsals are not for necessarily all works that musicians have never seen before.
Right. But it's no fewer than 3 rehearsals. That's what I'm trying to say. Sometimes 4, sometimes 5. So it's actually very well known in classical world example where Leonard Bernstein came to conduct Boston Symphony and asked for, I think, additional 15 minutes. Boston Symphony orchestra committee was elaborating on that for 45 minutes and has denied 15 minutes of extra rehearsal. And so Bernstein has never conducted in Boston again. Gets very, very upset.
It's just, I mean, there are so many different ways that, collective bargaining and so forth that musicians do need the protections of unions, but there are also ways in which,
right.
Instances like that just make your jaw drop.
Yes, but in Russia, it's not possible. In Russia, there are some orchestras, some theaters, Mariinsky Theater. If Gergiev needs extra time for rehearsal, he can take it and he can get this rehearsal anytime, day or night, and I mean it. So the result is that what is most important. I'm not saying that everybody's happy about that, but basically you have to get the result, and this is important. I have encountered this same attitude actually in Europe. It was particularly one about a year ago. I've conducted in Gotha, a wonderful symphony orchestra, one of the oldest in the world, and we ran out of time, but we had to polish a bit more. And on one hand, the head of the orchestra committee stood up and she said that time has run out. But on the other hand, immediately has been announced that we should vote for giving this program more time. And of course, it's been granted. And another hour and a half of rehearsal did happen. And
hour and a half
of rehearsal did happen. And yes, it was against the union rules, but musicians have pride. And it doesn't matter. They can willingly bend union rules. Of course, they wouldn't do it every day, of course, but they are proud of who they are. They're proud of the orchestra. They are proud of the result.
My mother was always sort of bitterly amused about, both in her experiences, as soloist, but also in various movies and so forth that she had seen, about the notion that, when the clock strikes the hour, if you're in the middle of a note, you stand up and you leave. That idea was comical to her.
It's unfortunately purely American. And the other sad story, and again, I think the symphonic culture, the music culture in America is great and still fantastic and wonderful. So don't take me wrong. But there are certain shortcomings, and I'm all for union. I think union must be present. It's essential, yes. But because of a prices that union had set up, like for a recording, for example, most of the soundtracks, or I should say probably all of them nowadays, are recorded elsewhere, not in the United States. It's very sad because I hear a certain soundtrack and I know that it could sound played by LA Symphony or any other great symphony in the United States would be sounding so much better than a small, tiny orchestra somewhere in Central Europe.
Where, because of budgetary constraints, quality was sacrificed for budget.
Exactly, exactly. So, and then you don't hear as many recordings of wonderful, phenomenal American orchestras nowadays because it's so expensive. It's
I think
so
it does need to
impossible.
be pointed out
So,
that both the conservatory system here and you know, the fact that classical music you know, does thrive in America is all the more impressive when you consider how it is not as central to American life as, let's say, sports are,
right.
or theater and movies. Whereas in Russia, the Russia that I knew secondhand only because, of course, I grew up in America, but in a Russian household. But in Russia, the things that seem to be more, I don't want to say valued, but the things that were more sort of central to the intellectual, cultural life of citizens were poetry, chess, music, uh, acting, yes, but I knew less about Russian movies than I did about Russian theater.
Hmm, hmm.
You know, the fact that in spite of not being as central in America, conservatories churn out phenomenal players. American orchestras perform at a level that is almost impossible to match anywhere in the world.
Exactly, exactly.
the
Yes,
the
yes,
possibilities are very much here. I
yes.
think,
Unbelievable possibilities, of
and to
course.
find a kind of silver lining in the pandemic, I think the one thing that I'm pinning a great many hopes on is that during this enforced silence for the past 8 or 9 months, um, organizations have been reaching out a lot to contact, to reach audiences virtually whom they would before not even be aware of those audiences' existence. If we come out of the pandemic with an understanding that there are literally millions of people out there who love music and want to consume it possibly on their own terms, uh, and if those millions, by the way, weren't there, where are all these people that are entering conservatories coming from? So there are millions out there. All we need to do is figure out how to maintain a contact with them. Something that I think they have figured out in Russia.
True, true. Well, it's also has something to do with a um, status in a society.
Mm.
Because I think in many European countries, if you're a musician, you are at the very high level of society, and it's not really necessarily measured only by how much you're making.
No, no, it's
Uh,
a matter of how important your position in that society is,
Correct,
how
yes.
vital you are.
As I have heard, unfortunately, many times in the United States, when people are asking, "Well, who are you? Who you are? What are you doing?"
Hmm.
And I'm saying I'm a musician, and they're saying, "Yes, but how do you make your living? What's your work? What's your line of work?"
But Volodya,
Actually,
I have to tell you the story of my first concert trip in Israel, concert tour in Israel. Um, the program was Mozart 5 and Paganini Campanella. I don't know why. Um, but I was being driven from Henry Crown Auditorium in Jerusalem back to my hotel by the French horn of the orchestra. And we're just chatting, and he says, "So what do you do for a living?" And I said, "This." And he said, "Yeah, well, I know, but I mean, I'm a plumber, and I play French horn." And I said, "No, no, no, this is all I do." Now, I was there as an artist from the United States who had been paid to come all the way to Israel. And I was playing a program that, frankly, I mean, Mozart, I don't know, but I already think Mozart is immensely difficult. But Paganini is not something that you play in the off hours when you know you're not doing some plumbing. And this principal French horn of the orchestra was sort of flummoxed. Well, you must do something for a living besides scratch the fiddle, you know?
well, he was wishing you well, I'm sure. So,
It was
um,
a way of complimenting me. Of course it was.
right. Well, I think we have come to the point to tell everybody that becoming a professional musician is a very, very difficult choice. And if I would say probably in Russia and many parts of Europe and Asia, it's a little bit easier to make a living, to survive as a musician. Well, I'm giving you an example. During this pandemic, most of musicians in European orchestras, as well as Russian orchestras, are still getting paid. they might not be paid as much as they were during normal, regular time, but they have been paid quite,
Enough to
as
live on, certainly.
quite enough to make a living. Yes, yes. Maybe it's not as fantastic living. They don't have 3 houses and very fancy cars, but they can survive. They can do. Contrary to many friends of mine in the United States who are not being able to perform and driving Uber now. And
well, take a look at one of the best orchestras in the United States with one of the highest pay scales pre-pandemic, the Metropolitan Orchestra.
Exactly, and a chorus,
Yeah.
Well.
1/3 of those musicians have felt it necessary to leave New York because the cost of living in New York, the rent and so forth, is so high.
And I think it's just the beginning. So it would be very hard to reassemble the same level of orchestras when pandemic will pass. And this is probably a good time to reorganize. It's a good time to, in a best American way, to get a positive result out of anything that is happening. And I think that's what Americans are known for. They're getting the best possible result out of hardship, out of hard time, and that's so important.
But you think that
so.
the orchestras in America will not reconstitute after the pandemic with the same personnel as before?
Well, I hope in many ways they will, but of course, the pandemic has been very, very damaging to those organizations. Very damaging.
Quite probably, the arts have been hit harder than any other sector, right?
Yes, yes. So it's time to reorganize. It's time to rethink how we can help to make arts part of life in the United States. And having said that, I must say that there's a wonderful drama actor in Russia who had said in one of the interviews that we should understand that the percentage of people who are coming to the theater, who are coming to classical music concert, is very low. But it's always those people who are driving the society into the future and who are helping everybody else. So those who are not coming to concert halls have been helped by those who are coming to concert halls. And of course, it has to do with an education as well. And I'm very proud to say that there's so many Americans who are studying musical instruments, who are studying music, other types of arts. Yes, nowadays probably there are more kids that are studying sports. They're doing sports than music. 30, 40 years ago, there was probably equal amount, I would say. But I'm hoping that parents, even those parents who have not come through art education nowadays, they will encourage their kids and they will understand the development of kids and development of kids' brains is very much depending on how much arts those kids will do. Well, think about this. As musicians, we have to act in 3 different timings simultaneously. How?
Past, present, future.
We are thinking and pre-hearing and presetting what we're supposed to play next notes, next bar, next line, right? We are playing what we are supposed to play right now, and we're analyzing what the notes that we just played before at the same time.
Yeah.
So
you're checking the windshield of your car, you're checking the rear view, and you are currently driving and aware of driving.
exactly.
Instead of doing them one after another, you're doing them simultaneously and reflexively.
Yes, and I would never forget the clipping from the newspaper in New York that said that pizza place so-and-so hiring drivers, delivery drivers, freelance musicians preferably. And I have called them actually, and I found out that a certain insurance company have found out that freelance musicians have much fewer accidents.
Really?
Yes. So that was, I'm very proud to say.
Is that a
that,
recent thing?
No. That was about, I think, about 19, 20 years ago.
But
So,
I would be curious to find out what those. I'm sure it's possible to get those stats.
yeah.
Send your kids into music because then they will have fewer car accidents. I think
Well,
that's a great argument.
Yeah, I mean, this is true, and this is a curiosity, of course. But I would say that
A logical outcome of what you said.
yes, and I would say that those neurological connections that are built by learning how to play an instrument are truly incredible. And I will give you another reason for that. When we get into a certain level of performance, we're not really performing on the instrument that we have in our hands. We're not really looking, if you're a violinist, you're not really looking into where your fingers on a fingerboard are moving. You really have in your mind built a virtual violin or virtual cello or virtual piano, because pianist is not looking constantly on the keyboard. So you have built your virtual instrument and you operating much quicker and much with much more efficiency, because you're operating your virtual instrument, and only then your brain's sending signals to your actual fingers. And so this work with image, something that shapes up your neurological connection.
The word image almost doesn't do it justice, because it's it's image, and it's sort of the ghost muscles that you're moving in your brain.
Yes. The same thing actually with the ballet dancers, for example, right? Because they're not operating with their own bodies. First, they operate with the image of their body built up in a brain. And then that image is sending all the signals to the actual body. So I think it's very, very important that parents understand how it is helping for development of their kids. And also, it is very, very important that somebody will set up those master classes, those lectures for parents, how to help their kids to study arts. There are so many underwater stones, so to speak, so many layers of difficulties in arts. It's so much depending on a full support system of the family.
Yeah, it has to be a perfect storm.
Yes. So that parents should know, and they should get, funny to say that, professional help from professional musicians or from parents whose kids are becoming professional musicians, who can tell them how they can help. And then the lives of kids who are studying arts would be much easier. They will get result with much better and quicker efficiency. And I think it also great for the family, because when a family comes together and helping their young ones to achieve, that makes whole family much happier organism, much happier structure than
not
before.
To mention the fact that the success of the promising young player is not largely, it is at least partially, possibly largely dependent on that support system. I have had students who have been outstanding students who did not have parental support. What they also had was no parental blocking, no obstacle from the parents. But primarily the students who are great at being students, who progress fastest, who are then presumably great at being professionals, are the ones whose parents have been with them every step of the way, not just driving them to lessons.
Exactly. And there's unfortunately sometimes a bit of a primitive knowledge that if parents just praising their kids, saying, "Oh, honey, this sounds great, this is so wonderful," that's not really a help.
No.
This is not building up their confidence at all, because somewhere deep inside they know that they might not be as great as their parents sing. So only a very truthful assessment of their success
For which the
is
parent has to be involved in the lesson process, in the
exactly,
conservatory or pre-college process. Yeah.
exactly.
You are from a musician family, and I'm from a musician family, so it's a little difficult for me to imagine what it would have been like for me to not be, growing up in a musical environment. When I
Right.
see it, I'm seeing it outside myself. But yeah, the parents who aren't just present in the lesson and reading a magazine, but who are present in the lesson and knowing um, what that lesson contains, the information that lesson contains, those parents are um, as good as another teacher. I would not be able to achieve the results with such successful students without the involvement of such involved parents.
I must say that I've rarely seen a successful musician or successful artist in any type of art who did not have family support, knowledgeable family support, really well structured family support.
Yeah.
It's a must. It's absolutely a must. And then I think it does help to build relationships between older and younger generation. I think with all the sometimes frustration, with all the maybe imposing on kids certain things, at least certain amount of time for practicing and all the stuff, it does help to build those connections between family members. So it's great for the families. Great if it's set up correctly. So.
This is where we are at the Kirov. This is where we are sort of hoping to get that message across to families, and to use as a model the hugely successful results of the Central Music School of Moscow, the Gnesian, the various Russian schools that felt like extended families.
Yes, and we should say that with all the negativity that is directed at Russia now, rarely we hear that Russian educational system is not good enough. We usually hear that educational system in Russia is still working just fine.
Yeah.
So and I must say, I have heard from my mom, who been studying with a great pianist Yakov Zak in Moscow Conservatory. When journalist asked this Yakov Zak, this pianist, if he prefers the Moscow School of Piano Playing or St. Petersburg School of Piano Playing, and he said, there are good musicians and there are not so good musicians. There's no difference in school from here or from there. So what I'm trying to say is that Americans do want for themselves, for their kids, the best possible result, the best possible enjoyment in life. And of course, arts brings a fantastic enjoyment into life. And I think Americans are absolutely capable. There is a one interesting point of view that I should bring out. I have been teaching at several universities, and I've been encountering this when in admission office, for example, you have several potential students who have pretty similar scores, pretty similar results, and you have to choose which one you admit, which one you give a scholarship, and which one you might not be able to admit or not being able to give a scholarship. And usually those kids who have the same scores but did study arts or sports are admitted first, for one simple reason. Those kids are adjusting into the environment. They are much better in society. They feel much more solid than those kids who haven't studied arts or sports. And it's those who have hard time settling in a society that usually transferring from one university to another, to next one, to next one, looking for the ideal, so to speak, environment. So instead of taking matters into their own hands and creating an environment around themselves. And that's what arts and sports are teaching so well. And I think it's a good investment into the future to learn the musical instruments, or yes, do sports. It can actually save you money in the long run, because your son or your daughter might get a scholarship because of their arts or sports achievement. Well, about sports, a lot of people know that, but about arts is also important. So it's very much a financial investment for the future as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much for your time, especially since tomorrow you have a concert and it is now midnight for you.
It's actually 1:30 a.m.
Oh dear God!
Oh no, it's 12. No, sorry, no, it's 12:15. Yes, sorry, yeah.
Okay.
My clock.
But
internal clock was saying
night
something.
Before a concert is still quite an imposition. So thank you very much for letting us impose on you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you, Emil, very much. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for having me on your show. It's a great pleasure, and especially because there are so many connections that we have between two of us, musical connections and friendship.
That's the thing. I feel like we didn't have a chance to even touch on 1/10 of that. So I hope that you would come back and that we could pick up the conversation kind of where we left off.
We should continue. And I also wanted to bring out one other point, that in arts, something that is very common is a stage fright, something that is affecting performance of many, especially young musicians, and sometimes not so young. And maybe at some point we should talk about that matter as well, because that issue could be helped greatly, and maybe in the future we can talk about that.
Absolutely, in possibly more of a seminar kind of setting also.
So Emil, I hope that we'll play together very soon. I miss your fantastic violin playing. So we should do it more often, and everywhere,
yes.
all around the world.
Not just here in the States.
Yes.
If people have questions for you, what I also suggest we do is that once this is streamed this afternoon, anyone who has questions, please write them in the comments, and I will endeavor to get those questions to Maestro Lande. Perhaps not a video answer, but at the very least a written or dictated answer might be possible. So join me next Friday at 3:00. Once again, it will be a surprise guest, but we will announce that this weekend. And the Friday after that at 3:00, this will hopefully be a regular encounter for us. Again, Maestro Lande, thank you.
Thank you, Emil, very much.
And I'll see you very soon, I hope.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thanks.